Chapter 1. Minnesota, August 1883. Benjamin carefully pulled weeds out of the ground surrounding his wife's grave. I miss you every day. The girls miss you, and are starting to make noise about wanting a new mom. He traced her name on the tombstone. Anna, the world was a good place when you were by my side, but now I feel like I'm surrounded by darkness. How could I ever find someone to be a new mom for our precious girls? He looked up at the sky, still angry with God for taking away his beautiful wife. I think I'm going to send for a mail-order bride. There's an agency out east that will send a woman out to me. I have to pay them, but I don't care. I don't really want a wife, but I do need a new mama for the girls. Abby starts school in just a year, and she's already telling me that she needs more grown-up dresses. I don't know how to dress a little girl. More helps, but she doesn't live with us, and I couldn't pull her away from far. I need a woman who will live with us to be a mother to the children. I guess I don't really need a bride. I need a mail-order mama to take care of our girls. He knew he was rambling, and anyone walking past the small cemetery would think he was crazy. I feel like I'm betraying you by even considering finding a new wife, but the girls need someone. He couldn't lie to Anna, even after she was dead. I need someone to keep me warm at night, but I won't fall in love with her, Anna. I promise you. He laid the flowers he and the girls had picked on her grave, and walked the short distance back to the home he shared with his daughters above the mercantile he owned. He'd gone out after work, but before he'd started supper. Abby did a good job of watching Georgie while he worked, but she was only 6, and he couldn't make himself leave them any longer, even though he could see their home from the cemetery. He had to worry twice as much now that Anna couldn't share the worries with him. He went to the table and called the girls to him. Once they were there, he told them about his decision. I've decided to send away for a mail-order bride, so you girls can have a mama again. Georgie hugged her father, and Abby just nodded solemnly. Both girls resembled their parents a great deal. Benjamin and Anna were both children of Norwegian immigrants, and had the typical Norwegian build and coloring. Both had the same blonde hair and blue eyes of their parents and their parents before them. Everyone had stopped and stared as he and Anna had walked along the street together. Now the girls both reminded him a great deal of his Anna. Every time he looked at them, she was on his mind. May we help you write the letter, Papa? The girls didn't use the Norwegian words for mother and father, more and far, like he and Anna had. They knew only a few words in the old language, and that suited Benjamin fine. He'd had to learn to speak English when he'd started school, and it had been hard for him. He wanted his girls to speak the language of their new country. They would know the Norwegian words they needed to keep his mother happy, but no more. Now his parents used English more than Norwegian at home anyway. Benjamin nodded. After supper, we'll write the best letter a bride has ever seen. He stood up to go into the kitchen, wondering what he'd do for supper. His mother had brought over some fresh bread just that morning. Maybe he could make some sandwiches. The girls hated them, but he knew very little about cooking and even less about cleaning. If Moore didn't clean his house every week and do his family's laundry, he didn't know how he'd manage. He quickly sliced the bread and fried some bacon, one of the few things he knew how to cook. He carried the bread and bacon to the table on plates along with some of his Moore's fresh butter. The girls came in to see what he'd set out to eat. Bacon sandwiches again? Georgie asked. Abby shook her head at her sister. Remember, he's getting us a mama to cook for us, she whispered. Georgie sat down at the table and buttered her bread, adding the bacon. Thanks for cooking, Papa. The words were said begrudgingly, but they were polite, and Benjamin couldn't ask for more. He was getting tired of bacon sandwiches himself. Abby took her seat and made her sandwich, and then they all bowed their heads to pray. Once Benjamin was finished, Abby started telling him all she wanted him to put in the letter. Tell her she needs to love little girls and know how to sew a dress. Georgie looked up at that. Tell her she needs to like to bake and cook things other than bacon sandwiches. And reading stories out loud. She needs to read us stories. Abby loved stories and couldn't wait to learn to read them for herself. She needs to like picnics and walking in the woods. Benjamin laughed softly. Why don't you girls save your ideas, and we'll write the letter just as soon as I finish up the supper dishes. He was happy the girls were so excited to have a new mama. It would help them to adjust to having a woman around. Asterisk. Massachusetts, September 1883. Emily sat in the parlor of the small house she shared with her mother, reading through the newspaper. She needed a new job. She was a cook for a well-to-do family in town, but they'd begun having her cook, clean and watch the children for no extra pay. She loved children, and she didn't mind cleaning up the messes she made, but she was still earning her very small salary. If she was going to do extra work, her pay needed to be higher commensurate with that work. She spotted an advertisement for mail-order brides and wrinkled her nose. She wanted to marry, but wasn't sure she could agree to something like that. She was glad she didn't have to. With as shy as she was, she may never find a man to marry, though. One day, she may find herself wanting to marry badly enough she'd answer an ad like that. She was glad that day wasn't today. Her eyes moved on quickly to the next ad. She heard the front door open and close and looked up as her mother joined her in their parlor. It was after 9 at night. Her mother had never stayed out that late, but she had gradually stayed out later and later during the time she'd been seeing her new beau, William. "How was your evening?" she asked, noting the sparkle in her mother's eyes. Jane held out her hand to show something to Emily. "A ring." "It's beautiful, Mother." William was her mother's first beau since her father was killed in Hendersonville, North Carolina during the war. From William? Of course it was from William. Who else would be buying her mother rings? Jane nodded, her face pink with happiness. "He asked me to marry him." Emily jumped to her feet and hugged her mother. "I'm so happy for you." Emily and her mother had been everything to one another since her father had died. She was thrilled her mother had finally found a man to make her happy. "I was a little worried you'd think he was trying to take your father's place." Jane's face was serious as she searched her daughters. Emily shrugged. "I don't have any memories of my father at all, so I don't mind. I'm just glad you're happy." Jane sat down next to Emily on the small pink sofa. "There is one thing, though." Jane looked worried about whatever it was. They'd always been completely honest with one another, so Emily was surprised. "What is it?" Emily took Jane's hand in hers to give her courage to tell her about whatever was troubling her. Jane took a deep breath, staring down at her hands. "William wants us to be alone. He thinks it could hurt our marriage to have you living in the house with us." Emily's eyes widened. At 20, she'd never even had a beau. It hadn't occurred to her she would need to find a place to live anytime soon. Her heart jumped into her throat and she wanted to protest, but she looked at her mother's face and knew her happiness came first. She'd been 20 with a 2-year-old child when her husband died, and she'd found a job and supported them both for years. "I understand. When will the wedding take place?" "In 2 months. I hope it will give you enough time." Jane was obviously worried about sending her daughter away, but she wanted to marry William, and it was time she did something for herself for a change. "I'll figure something out." Emily's mind frantically reviewed what she'd just seen in the paper. Not only would she need a better paying job, but a place to live as well. She took the paper and stood up. "I'm going to bed. Tomorrow's a work day." As she climbed the stairs, Emily knew she wouldn't be blowing out the light anytime soon. She'd spend the night searching for something, anything, she could do to support herself. She went into her room and quickly changed into her nightgown and braided her long brunette hair before lying down on the bed with the newspaper. She quickly read through the rest of the want ads, but there were very few jobs for a woman in Beckham. It was a mid-sized town, but most of the women stayed home with their families. Her eyes landed once again on the advertisement for a mail-order bride. She read it over carefully. Mail-order bride agency needs women who are looking for the adventure of their lives. Men out west need women to marry. Reply in person at 300 Rock Creek Road. See Mrs. Harriet Long. Emily bit her lip. Could she really do such a thing? It would solve a lot of her problems. She wouldn't need to get a job, and she'd have a place to live. Of course, she'd also be married to a man she'd never met. Did she really have another option, though? Asterisk. Emily spent the day cooking with Mary and Sally, the children of the Walters, the family she worked for. The girls wanted to learn how to bake cakes, so she was once again teaching them. She couldn't help but wonder if their mother told them to ask her how to cook various things so she could get some time away and not have to hire a nurse for them. She enjoyed having the children with her, but it did make her day harder. She fixed 3 meals per day for the family of 4, and when the girls were with her, she tended to have to clean up more messes and do extra baking. The girls were 3 and 5, and made more messes than she had ever dreamed possible. She would put the youngest in a chair at the table and have to help her do everything. The older girl was a little better, but not by much. At one point, halfway through the day, she looked up to see Mary, the 3-year-old, throwing eggs on the floor. Where did she get eggs from? Emily asked, her pointed gaze fixed on Sally. Sally smiled and shrugged her shoulders, trying to look innocent. Because Emily had no true authority over the girls, she couldn't punish them for their misdeeds, so she let it go and patiently cleaned up the mess. Before the day was out, she'd mopped the kitchen floor 6 times. She was exhausted. She was also determined to stop by the address on Rock Creek Road on her way home. Being a mail-order bride couldn't possibly compare to the hassle of working with the 2 Walters daughters. How could having her own home be worse than working with the 2 destructive girls? At the end of the day, she stood in the spotless kitchen and thanked Mrs. Walters for her wages. She was always paid on Saturdays, but her money went straight to her mother for the household expenses. How could she save up enough money to move out on her own when she had to give all her money to her mother simply to make ends meet? On her way home, she stopped at the address on Rock Creek Road. She knew where the road was, of course, but had never been on it. The house named in the address was large and intimidating. Emily had grown up in a small home, but her mother talked about the grand house she'd lived in with her parents before the war. They'd both died during the war, but Emily had frequently daydreamed about living in their beautiful home with them. For a moment, looking up at the house, she lost her nerve and started to walk away. She'd taken 10 steps before she caught herself and turned back around, marching straight up to the door and knocking. The door was answered by a tall, dark man in a butler's uniform. Yes? I'm here to see Mrs. Harriet Long, please. She made sure her voice was strong as she asked, but it would have been so much easier to mumble. Emily hated having to speak with strangers more than just about anything in the world. She'd stayed at a bad job for 2 years rather than interview for something else, because she was so nervous about meeting strangers. The man nodded and stepped aside to allow her into the home. She stared around her in awe, never having been in a home so beautiful. Right this way, miss? Emily tore her gaze from a painting on the wall to follow the butler. Hughes. Emily Hughes. She needed to stop gawking instead of looking like she'd never seen an affluent house before, so she forced her eyes on the butler's back as she followed him through the house. He led her down a long hallway and stopped at a doorway on the left. Ma'am? There's a Miss Emily Hughes to see you. Emily's first impression of Harriet was surprise. A woman so young, and so obviously wealthy, would have an agency for mail-order brides. Harriet couldn't be more than 28 and had her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her petite form was encased in a blue silk dress that Emily was sure would have cost 6 weeks' worth of her wages. Harriet stood and moved across the room to where Emily stood in the hall. Emily noted her movements were graceful despite a pronounced limp. She held her hand out. It's nice to meet you, Emily. I'm Harriet Long. I came about your advertisement in the paper, Emily blurted out quickly as she shook Harriet's hand. Harriet's smile brightened her entire face and made her eyes twinkle with laughter. I presumed as much. She turned to the butler. Would you bring some tea and cookies, Higgins? Right away, ma'am. He left them alone, quietly closing the door behind him. Come and sit with me. We'll talk, and I'll see if I can find a man who would suit you. Harriet waited until Emily was seated before continuing. What made you decide to come to me? Emily let out a heavy sigh. It was never my plan to be a mail-order bride. She looked into Harriet's green eyes as she spoke, finding them warm and full of laughter. I've lived with my mother my entire life. My father was killed in the war. At Harriet's nod, she continued, determined to get the full story out. My mother and I are extremely close, and as she never remarried, I've been working and contributing to the household income for the last 3 years since I finished my schooling. How old are you now? Harriet pulled out a piece of paper to jot down notes on what Emily told her. I'm 20. She waited until Harriet wrote something down and returned her attention to her before adding, my mother has been seeing a man for the last several months. He's her first beau since my father died. Emily rubbed the back of her neck, the strain of the last day obvious in her stature. Last night she came home and told me he'd asked her to marry him. I'm thrilled for her, of course. She deserves to be loved. Of course. Harriet watched her carefully as if she were waiting to hear why she was stating the obvious. But her fiancé doesn't wish to have me living in the home with them once they're married. He feels there wouldn't be enough privacy if I were there, which I understand completely, but it does leave me out in the cold. Emily tried her best not to sound hurt by the situation, but she realized she was in a way. She didn't want her mother to choose her over William, but she did want her to think she was important enough to consider. Harriet nodded. Yes, that's more than a bit of a bind they're leaving you in. You said you've worked for the past 3 years? What do you do? Harriet seemed to be genuinely interested in Emily's answers for more than just business reasons, which made her much easier to talk to than most people. Emily let out a half laugh. I work as a cook, but often I'm expected to clean and take care of the children of the household as well. Harriet raised an eyebrow. And you're paid extra for those tasks? Of course not. I'm paid as a cook, nothing more. I see. Do you enjoy working with the children? Emily nodded. I do enjoy them, but they make my job a great deal harder. She explained the messes they'd made during the long day and how many times she'd had to mop the floor. If all I had to do was mind the children, I wouldn't mind so much, but my employer enjoys giving dinner parties. She gave one tonight, in fact. So while I was cooking for her party, I was minding the children who were destroying the kitchen. Harriet smiled. I suppose that would explain the flower in your hair. Emily groaned, running a hand across the top of her head, messing up her severe bun. I should have checked my appearance before I came. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Long. Emily was embarrassed to be seen by anyone with flour in her hair. She usually checked her appearance before leaving work, but she'd been in a hurry to go to Rock Creek Road and start working toward becoming a mail-order bride. It's not a problem. If you were a wife, there would be times when your husband would come home and there would be flour in your hair. You're interviewing to be a wife. She turned to the desk she was sitting in front of and quickly looked through the letters in front of her. I put an advertisement in a few papers out west thinking I would get enough responses to place the 5 women I had available for marriage. I received 12 letters in response. I found one other young lady to send, but you, my dear, are a godsend. She obviously found what she was looking for and held up a letter. I think this is the letter for you. She handed it to Emily and invited her to open it, making a few more notes as she waited for Emily to read it. Unfolding the single page of paper, Emily read the letter. Dear potential bride, I'm a single father of 2 daughters aged 4 and 6. Their names are Georgie and Abby. My wife died of scarlet fever a couple of months ago, and I admit, I'm frantic trying to keep my household together. My daughters are insisting I put several things in this letter, so here is what they require in their mail order, Mama. She must be able to cook more things than bacon, and must never serve a bacon sandwich for supper. She must love children, especially daughters, and enjoy reading to them at night. She must know how to sew pretty dresses and fix hair just so. She must be able to smile even when her new daughters make a mess. She must like to bake and enjoy picnicking and walks in the woods. On my part, I'm looking for a wife who will be willing to take on the duties of motherhood and be a good wife. I would not dream of finding a new wife so quickly if my daughters were not so badly in need of a new mother. I would like to have a wife who would occasionally be willing to help out in the mercantile store I own here in Live Oak, Minnesota. If you think you can be all of that to 3 very lonely people who need a good woman in their lives, please respond. I am 28 years old, and would like a woman who is at least 20, but not more than 25. My daughters and I await your response. My best, Benjamin Johnson. Emily looked up when she was finished to find Harriet watching her. What do you think? Emily nodded slowly. They sound like the kind of family I could be content with. I think. She bit her lip considering her situation. So what now? I just write them a letter? Do I write it through you? Do I have to pay you to help me? No, you don't pay me. There's a small fee for the gentleman requesting a wife, but nothing for the bride. You write a letter here, or you go home and write a letter and bring it to me to mail. All correspondence will go through me. What's our time frame? At Emily's blank stare, she asked, when is your mother getting married? Oh. I was lost in my thoughts thinking about the Johnson family. My mother's getting married in 2 months, so I need to be ready to leave before then. She knew it wasn't much time and she bit her lip wondering how Mrs. Long would react to the rushed time frame. We can make that happen. Why don't we write your letter together, and I'll mail it off for you? So many times, women forget to include pertinent details, and they kick themselves later. I have a list of things I try to make sure every letter includes, so it would be easier to do it here. The more complete your first letter is, the faster we can get you married. Emily was relieved. She wasn't sure she could think of everything she needed to say without help, so she was thrilled to be able to do it with Harriet. Harriet handed her a piece of paper and a pen, so she quickly wrote, Dear Benjamin, Abby and Georgie, I enjoyed reading your letter. I have never served a meal of bacon sandwiches in my life, and I work as a cook for a living. Rest assured you will have a variety of food if you choose me to be your new mama. She looked up and read what she'd written aloud. Harriet smiled and nodded. That's good. Answer their direct questions and requirements first, and then you can go on and add the other pertinent details. You finish that part, and let me know when you need help with the things you need to include. Emily dipped her pen in the inkwell, then put the pen to paper and wrote, I love reading to children, especially girls, at any time of day, and I'm sure that will translate well to daughters, although I've never had one and can't be absolutely certain about that. I'm an adequate seamstress and know exactly how a little girl's hair should look, so there are no problems there. I expect children to make a mess, because if they couldn't make messes, they couldn't learn. I love to bake and enjoy both picnicking and walks in the woods, although I've not had a lot of time for either in my busy life. I'm very sorry to hear about the loss of your wife. I lost my father at a very young age and know from personal experience how hard it is to grow up with only one parent. I'm more than willing to help out in a mercantile and would enjoy it immensely. I am 20 years old, and my name is Emily Hughes. I live with my mother in Beckham, Massachusetts. I've never been to Minnesota, or anywhere outside of Massachusetts, but would like to go there. When she was finished writing, Emily read the letter she'd written to Harriet. What else should I add? You want to tell them what you look like, and what interests you. Ask if they have any pets or anything else you want to know about them. Emily nodded and wrote quickly, I am a short woman with auburn hair and blue eyes. I enjoy reading when I have time and taking walks to enjoy nature. What do you like to do as a family? What are the girls interested in? Are there any other questions you have for me? Again, she read what she'd written aloud. Harriet smiled. I think that's perfect. Sign it and I'll send it off with the mail tomorrow. We'll expect a response in a month or so. She squeezed Emily's hand. If we don't have you married off before your mother needs you out of the house, you can stay here for a few days, but I do believe we'll have you on a train for Minnesota within the next 2 months. Emily stood. Thank you for the cookies and tea and for your time. I appreciate you helping me. Harriet stood as well. As Emily watched her slowly gain her feet, she wondered again about the limp. It would be impolite to ask her though, so she brushed it off and headed for the door. Harriet saw her out. Come see me in 3.5 weeks and we'll talk about where to go from there. Emily left the house and headed for home, her heart filled with trepidation. She needed to focus on the idea of being a mother to 2 little girls who needed her and helping her mother by leaving. She needed to do her best not to think about the fact she'd be marrying a man she'd never met. She couldn't think about that. The family did seem like a good one, and she only hoped she could find the courage to go through with the plans she'd set into motion. Chapter 2. Benjamin smiled as he gave Mrs. Anderson her change. Thanks for coming in, Mrs. Anderson. Where else would I go? You're the only mercantile in town. Mrs. Anderson was a straight-shooting woman in her mid-70s. Benjamin was always glad to see her, because it meant her arthritis wasn't acting up too much for her to walk to the store. Sometimes, she would send a messenger over with her list and Benjamin would deliver it when he got off work for the day. You could always drive to St. Paul. She shook her head. My bones are too old for that, Benjamin. I'll walk right over here to your mercantile any day of the week. You look just as spry as ever, Mrs. Anderson. If I didn't know how much you loved Mr. Anderson, I'd ask if I could come calling. He gave her a slow wink to punctuate his words. He'd learned early on that flirting with his elderly customers helped them to come back, and he genuinely liked Mrs. Anderson. She never gossiped and was always pleasant to be around. She chuckled. You're a naughty boy, Benjamin. She leaned heavily on her cane as she walked toward the door, her shopping basket tucked over her arm. The bell on the door tinkled, and they both turned to see who was coming into the store. More, are you coming to keep my daughters and me from starving to death? Mrs. Anderson smiled and nodded at Ingrid Johnson. You need to watch this silver-tongued boy of yours, Ingrid. He's been flirting with me, and here I am, old enough to be his grandmother. She walked slowly out the door and waved over her shoulder to Benjamin as she left the store. Ingrid smiled at her son. I brought some bread and a big pot of stew for you and the girls for supper. It's enough for 2 nights, so make it stretch. She held up a letter. Who is this Harriet Long who is writing to you from Massachusetts? What are you hiding from me? She said the words as if they were a joke, but he could tell by the narrowing of her eyes, she was serious. Benjamin sighed. He'd hoped to put off this discussion for longer, but what could he do? I've sent off for a mail-order bride. The girls need a woman around the house, and I don't have it in me to try and court someone right now. But what about Kristen? I talked to her about you, and she's willing to have you call on her. Kristen was a local Norwegian girl who lived a few miles out of town. Benjamin had known her all his life, and simply wasn't interested in her. She was nice enough, but he wasn't attracted to her. I'm sorry, Moore. I don't think she's what I'm looking for. He held his hand out for the letter. How could he explain to his mother that Kristen was too much like Anna? He didn't want to be married to someone who would remind him of his dead wife for the rest of his life. So you're willing to just gamble someone who you don't even know will be a good mother to my grandbabies? It's my life, and it's my decision. I'm their father. May I please have my letter? His empty hand was still hanging in the air waiting. She slapped it into his hand. Don't you come crying to me when she turns out to be an awful woman who doesn't even know how to cook a simple Norwegian dish. Why you'd send for a mail-order bride is simply beyond me. Kristen is just perfect and she's only a few miles away. She mumbled something to herself as she headed for the door. He was thankful he couldn't hear what it was. I'll put your stew and bread in your house and spend a little time with my girls. The door slammed behind her, leaving him in no doubt about how she felt about the letter in his hand. He slipped the letter into his pocket without reading it. He wanted to read it with the girls so they could all make the decision together. Their opinion on the matter was just as important as his. If he read it before he arrived home, he could make up his mind and be disappointed if they didn't agree with him. No, it would affect them all, and they'd decide as a family. After closing up shop for the day, Benjamin slipped out the back to the house he shared with the girls. He could smell the pot of stew cooking and inhaled deeply. His Moore wasn't perfect, but she was a wonderful cook, and he was fortunate to have her. Girls. I'm home. The girls came running to see him, each hugging him tightly. Farmore came and brought supper. We don't have to have bacon sandwiches tonight. Georgie was bouncing up and down. Benjamin smiled. Maybe we'll be done with bacon sandwiches soon. He pulled the letter out of his pocket. Look what came in the mail today. Is it from our mail order mama? Abby asked. Benjamin nodded. At least it's from someone who wants to be our mail order mama. We'll read it after supper and see if she'll suit us. Who's hungry? The girls quickly set the table while Benjamin served them each a bowl of stew and cut up the bread. Once he'd done the supper dishes, they all sat at the table together to listen to Benjamin read the letter. The girls interrupted repeatedly as they liked what was said. She's a cook, Papa. No more bacon. Georgie couldn't get past the idea of having a mother who would cook for them. She likes to read and go for walks. Oh, Papa. Let's marry her. Abby insisted. Once he was done, he set the letter down, his mind racing. If he sent her train tickets with this letter, she could be there in as little as 3 weeks. 2 weeks for the letter to get to Beckham, a few days to prepare, and a 5-day train ride. He'd have to close the shop for a day to drive into St. Paul, but it would be worth the lost income. It was Friday, and they could drive into St. Paul Sunday when the store was closed anyway to buy the tickets for her to come out. He'd buy tickets for her to leave Massachusetts 2 weeks from Wednesday, and they could pick her up on the following Monday. In 24 days he could have a mother for his girls. We'll skip church on Sunday and drive to St. Paul to buy her a train ticket. Would you girls like that? Georgie jumped up and down clapping her hands while Abby smiled and nodded happily. Benjamin had Abby bring him a pen, paper and ink so he could write a letter to send with the ticket. He was glad it was so easy to pick out a new mama for his girls. Asterisk. It had been 3.5 weeks since she'd mailed the letter, so Emily decided to stop off at Harriet's house on her way home from work. It had been a hectic Thursday at work, because the Walters were having another dinner party. The parties were happening more and more often, multiplying her workload. Today, Mrs. Walters had asked her to dust the entire downstairs of the house as well so it would look good for her guests. Emily had barely finished fixing the meal when it was time for the guests to arrive. She inhaled the scent of the autumn air as she walked. She loved the fall when the leaves were changing colors and the air was cool, but not cold. She enjoyed the sound of the leaves crackling under her feet as she headed down Rock Creek Road. She slowed her steps as she neared her destination, afraid there had been a letter and the family didn't want her, but more afraid there had been a letter and the family did want her. She all but dragged her feet as she headed to the front door, and taking a deep breath, she knocked. Higgins answered again. "It's good to see you again, Miss Hughes." He opened the door wide to let her in. "Please follow me." He led her down the hall to the parlor Harriet used as an office. "Miss Hughes is here to see you, ma'am." Harriet rose to her feet, Thank you, Higgins. Tea and cookies, ma'am? Yes, please. Harriet waited until he'd closed the door behind him before addressing Emily. Your letter arrived yesterday. I haven't read it, because you should be the one to do that. Please sit down. She turned and headed to her desk. Emily sank onto the rose-patterned sofa and waited while Harriet dug through the papers on her desk. Once she produced the letter and handed it to Emily, Harriet sat down in her chair and turned her attention to other work while Emily read her letter. Dear Emily, you sound like exactly what our family needs. I've enclosed tickets for a train from Beckham, Massachusetts to St. Paul, Minnesota. You'll need to switch trains in Chicago. I will close my shop for the day and meet you at the station in St. Paul. Live Oak is a 2-hour drive north of St. Paul, so after you arrive we'll return here to marry. My girls are very excited to know you will be arriving soon. I'll see you on the 15th of October at the train station. I will not have the girls with me. I'm a tall blonde Norwegian man and will have a sign with your name on it. I look forward to meeting you. Best, Benjamin. Emily took a deep breath to try to calm herself. This was what she wanted and needed, so why was she so frightened? He sent me train tickets for Wednesday of next week. Harriet smiled happily. That's wonderful. It's just what you need. She took the letter from Emily and skimmed over it, taking the check that had been sent for her services and placing it aside. There was also a small sum of money for Emily's needs which she handed to the younger woman along with the train tickets. Let's go over what you'll need to take with you. Harriet had a list of things she gave to each of the young brides she sent off. She handed it to Emily to skim over. I don't have a wedding dress, Emily muttered. Well, there's enough money there to get one. It doesn't have to be a traditional wedding dress, though it would be nice. We'll see what we can find. Emily read a few more things on the list and handed it back. I wish I had time to make a new wardrobe, because my clothes are hopelessly out of fashion, but I don't. I hope my new family won't mind. She hated the idea of going to her new family with her old clothes, but she had no time to make more. She barely had time to get used to the idea before she was leaving. Was this really a good idea? Harriet smiled, squeezing the younger woman's hand. I don't think that will be a problem. Your future husband owns a mercantile, so you'll be able to get what you need relatively quickly. I'm really nervous. I'm not sure this is what I should be doing, Emily confessed. I understand. You have every reason to be nervous, but this is an answer to your prayers. Your situation is a tough one, and we couldn't have found a better family for you. Harriet's voice was soothing and calm. Would it help you if I went to the train station with you to see you off? Emily nodded slowly. Would you mind? She knew it was a lot to ask of a virtual stranger, but Harriet had been so sweet to offer, and she really didn't want to go alone. Not at all. I'm sending you off into an unknown situation. What time does your train leave on Wednesday? Emily glanced at the ticket to check. 10 in the morning. Why don't you come to my house around 8:30? We'll walk to the station together. Emily stood. Thank you for all your help. Harriet gripped Emily's hands between her own. It's not a problem. If you need anything between now and when you leave Beckham, I want you to let me know right away. I will. Harriet walked her to the door, and Emily waved. Goodbye. She took the long way home as she walked through the dark streets of Beckham. She'd never been further than 5 miles from the town, and she couldn't imagine what it would be like to leave and never see it again. When she arrived home, she found her mother waiting for her in the parlor. I was getting worried. You were out so late. Emily had always come straight home after work, and although she'd known she'd be going to see Harriet that evening, she hadn't wanted to involve her mother and have her worried about Emily's decision before it was officially made. Emily joined Jane on the sofa. I'm sorry I worried you. I was speaking with Harriet Long. Do you know her? Jane seemed to think about it for a moment. She knew the name, but wasn't sure if she'd ever met the woman. I'm not sure. Why? Well, she's matching women who need husbands up with men in the West. I'm going to be a mail-order bride. Emily spoke quickly to get the words out. She hadn't been looking forward to telling her mother what her decision had been. Jane's eyes widened with surprise. Where will you go? I've agreed to marry a man in Minnesota. He lost his wife a few months ago, and he needs a mother for his 2 young daughters. They seem like a very nice family. She held up the letter and train tickets for her mother to see. When will you leave? Wednesday morning. I'll be married on October 15th in the small town in Minnesota where he lives. Emily's eyes met her mother's, quietly pleading with her to find a way for her to stay. Surely William would change his mind rather than send her off to live with total strangers halfway across the continent. Jane squeezed Emily's hand. I'm so happy you found a good situation. I'll miss you, of course, but we can always write. Jane looked extremely relieved to know Emily had found a good place to go. I'll miss you, too. Emily tried not to let her mother see how upset she was by the idea of going off to Minnesota. I need to figure out what to wear for my wedding, she said, changing the subject abruptly. I don't think I have anything suitable at all. She knew her mother would help her solve her little problem and they could quit talking about her move. She didn't want to cry in front of her mother at the prospect of going away, and focusing on the task at hand would be the perfect way to distract them both. Why don't you wear the dress I wore to marry your father? You still have it? Emily asked in surprise. They'd been sewing frantically trying to get a dress ready for her mother to wear when she married William. Why aren't you wearing it for your own wedding? Jane smiled. It's much too small for me now, but it should fit you perfectly. Besides, I couldn't marry another man in the dress I wore to marry your father. It wouldn't be right. She stood up, excitement dancing in her eyes. She was still slender, but when she'd married she'd been reed thin like her daughter. Let's go see if it fits. She hurried through their small house and up the stairs to her bedroom. She knelt in front of the chest at the foot of her bed and opened it. Emily had always thought of the chest as her mother's treasure box. Emily stood watching as her mother dug through the box. She took several things out and stroked them. This was your first church dress. You only wore it a few times, but you were so pretty in it. She dug some more. This is the quilt I made you when I was carrying you. She laid it on top of the small dress. Ah, here it is. Jane pulled out a long white dress covered in lace. She held it up in front of her. What do you think? Emily reached out and touched the lace on the dress. It was old-fashioned, but beautiful, and so many women wore their mother's dresses to marry, it being old-fashioned wouldn't matter a bit. I love it. Do you think it'll fit? I think so. We'll probably have to take it in a bit in the waist, and we'll definitely have to shorten it, but I think it'll work out very well for you. Let me help you try it on, and we can make the adjustments before you go. Emily hugged her mother tightly. Thank you for letting me wear your beautiful dress. The dress made her excited for the wedding for the first time. She had never worn anything so beautiful. Jane smiled. I'm happy that you want to. I only wish I could be there to see you married in it. Emily nodded sadly. I know. I won't be there for your wedding either. She wished she could see her mother's happiness on her wedding day, but knew it was impossible. I'm not sure what I'm going to do without you. You're going to be happy with your new husband. That's what you're going to do. Asterisk. Emily was thrilled to be able to give her notice at work the following morning. She didn't feel at all badly for what Mrs. Walters referred to as her abandonment. You've been with us for 3 years. How can you just leave this way? I can't come to work here when I'm living in Minnesota. I'm sure you'll find someone else to cook for you. And clean and watch your children for you. My last day will be Tuesday. But it's Friday. I can't possibly find someone else so soon. Emily found the idea didn't bother her a bit. She didn't mind leaving Mrs. Walters in a bind after the way she'd treated her. You may have to do for yourself for a few days, but it won't be the end of the world. Mrs. Walters frowned. Are you getting snide with me? No, ma'am. I would never do that. I'd love to, but I need the last few days of work, she thought. After Mrs. Walters left her alone in the kitchen to work, Emily had to refrain from shouting for joy. She was nervous about the wedding, but she was thrilled to leave her job behind. Asterisk. Every evening Emily and her mother worked together on their wedding dresses. Emily was glad she'd have this last memory of her mother to take with her. They talked and laughed about different things they'd done together over the years. Emily talked to her mother about the first letter she'd received from the Johnson family where the girls had requested someone who knew how to cook more than bacon and wouldn't ever fix bacon sandwiches for dinner. Jane laughed aloud. That man is lost without a wife beside him. The poor girls. I bet they're ready to have you there. It certainly does sound like it. I can't wait to meet them. He's going to be meeting me in St. Paul at the train station, but he won't be bringing the girls. She wished he would, because it would be easier for her, but there was no time to write him to request that, and she doubted she would make the request even if there had been time. At least you won't have to worry about them being upset that he's remarrying. It sounds like they practically begged him to place the ad. That's the impression I got from the letters. Emily held her dress in front of her. I think I'm finished. She looked down at it to be certain she hadn't made any mistakes. A mistake on a regular dress was bad enough. A mistake on her wedding dress would be terrible, because it would be the first impression most people would have of her. She hoped he hadn't invited more than a handful of people to the wedding. Go try it on. I want to see how it looks. It was late Tuesday evening. They both should have been in bed hours before, but the dress needed to be finished. Emily knew she could always sleep on the train. She had grown more and more nervous by the day. Her first train ride and a wedding all in 1 week. It was enough to give a woman heart palpitations. She ran up the narrow stairs to her bedroom to change. Once she was in her room, she looked around her. All of her personal belongings were gone. The only things left were the sturdy bed she'd slept on since she was a small girl, a small dresser and an armoire against one wall. All of her clothes were neatly pressed and in a carpet bag. It saddened her to realize everything she owned fit into such a small bag. She stripped out of her dress and pulled the wedding dress over her head. It was tight in the waist, but fell comfortably around her hips and stopped just above her shoes. She walked down the stairs where her mother waited. When Emily walked into the parlor where she'd been sewing with Jane, her mother covered her mouth with one hand, tears springing to her eyes. Oh, Emily. You look so beautiful. Emily smiled. She knew she wasn't really beautiful, and it was just a mother's love that made it seem so, but still it felt good to hear the words. She turned in a slow circle. Is the hem straight? It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. If your father could see you now, he would be so proud of the young lady you've become. Jane set her dress to the side and walked to her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace. I'm going to miss you so much. Emily hugged her back. I'll miss you too, Mama. She pulled back. Just think, in a week, I'm going to be married with 2 daughters of my own. The idea was still baffling to her, but she acted as if it were an everyday occurrence to travel across the country to marry a complete stranger. Jane swiped at a tear running down her cheek. It's so hard to believe my daughter is old enough to marry. Promise me you'll write often. Emily sniffed back a tear of her own. Of course, I will. I promise. Asterisk. Harriet herself answered the door when Emily knocked the following morning. Are you all ready? Harriet looked the younger woman up and down taking her measure. Emily nodded. I finished my wedding dress just last night. I didn't have time to make any other clothes, but you're right, I can handle that when I get to Minnesota. Harriet stepped onto the front porch, and they walked together toward the train station. Do you have your ticket and the spending money Mr. Johnson sent you? You'll need the money for food on the train. She patted the small bag over her shoulder. I packed you some sandwiches that will work for today to get you started. Oh, thank you. Emily was surprised by the other woman's small act of kindness. Yes, I have everything. I even have the dress I wore to church my first day there and the quilt my mother made for me before I was born. Harriet eyed the bag Emily carried. I hope you remembered to pack some clothes as well. She sounded doubtful as she looked at the size of the bag. Emily laughed. I only have 2 work dresses, a Sunday dress, and now my wedding dress. There was plenty of room for other things. Emily was wearing her Sunday dress and a long winter coat. It was getting chilly in the mornings now that they were well into October. Thank you for seeing me off. It does make it easier for me. When they arrived at the train station, the 2 women sat together and spoke loudly to be heard over the din. I want you to write to me as soon as you get to Minnesota. After you've been married a week or 2, you need to write again so I'll know you're in a good situation. If anything is wrong, we'll find a way to get you out. What do you mean? Emily asked. Marriage was forever. No matter what kind of situation she found herself in, she had no right to leave or even think about leaving. Surely Harriet knew that. Some men hit their wives or treat them badly. If that happens to you, even once, you need to write to me and I'll send you a train ticket home. Do you understand? The look in Harriet's eyes was intense as she spoke. Emily nodded, wondering why Harriet was bringing it up. I will. She didn't think she could, but it seemed so important to Harriet, she would agree to anything to give the other woman peace of mind. There's no reason for any woman to ever stay in a bad situation. All women should be told that before they marry. I'll remember. The conductor called then. All aboard. Emily stood. I guess this is goodbye. Thank you for all your help, and I'll write as soon as I get there. It seemed strange that she felt such a close friendship with this woman when they'd only met a few times. She was truly going to miss her, though. I appreciate it. I'll be watching for your letter. On impulse, Emily hugged the other woman. Goodbye. Thanks for being my friend when I needed one. Harriet clutched the younger woman to her. Everyone deserves to have a friend when they need one. Harriet stood watching the younger woman until she was on the train, and then watched as the train pulled out of the station. She said a quick prayer the girl would find what she needed in Minnesota before turning to walk home through the streets of Beckham. She wouldn't receive the letter telling her Emily was safe fast enough. Chapter 3. Emily felt overwhelmed by the huge crowd at the St. Paul train station. How was she going to be able to spot Benjamin with all these people around? She fought the panic rising in her throat and concentrated on what he'd told her in his letter. He was a tall blonde and would be holding a sign with her name on it. She was short enough she had to stand on tiptoe to see over the shoulders of the people in front of her. Had he decided not to come? What would she do if he left her stranded there at the train station? She hated crowds, and the panic that came from being in the center of one was getting worse and worse. She needed to find him and get out of the city as quickly as she could, but the longer she stood there, the harder it became for her to see out through the crowd. She forced herself to breathe slowly and evenly. Please, God, let this crowd move so I can see him. The couple in front of her moved off and she could finally see out over the ocean of faces. Off to the side, she saw a tall man holding a sign painted on a piece of wood over his head. It read, Emily Hughes. She breathed a sigh of relief, picked up her bag and made her way to the man weaving in and out of people on her way. She stopped in front of him and mumbled, I'm Emily. He looked at her in surprise for a moment. She'd said she was short, but this girl couldn't be 20, could she? She was much too small to be the one he was looking for. You're Emily Hughes? Here to marry Benjamin Johnson, he asked in a big booming voice. She nodded. Why did he look so surprised? She'd described herself. Was she not what he'd expected? Why does she look like she's afraid of her own shadow? He wondered. He took her bag from her hand and led her to his buggy. In his mind, she'd been taller and blonder. Sure, she'd told him she was a brunette, but somehow, in his mind, she looked just like Anna. She wasn't what he'd expected in a bride, and he found himself instantly disappointed. Anna had been so outgoing, everyone crowded around her everywhere she went. He imagined Emily would be the one hiding in the corner at church socials so she didn't actually have to talk to anyone. And her clothes. What was she thinking coming out here to get married in clothes that were so ragged? Did she not realize he was a businessman and he needed his wife to live up to his reputation? He hoped she'd pack something suitable to be married in. When they reached his buggy, he put his bag in the back and held out his hand to help her into her seat. She'd rarely ridden behind a horse. She and her mother had never owned one. They'd been able to walk everywhere they needed to go in their small town. Once she was seated, he walked around and climbed up beside her. Did you have a good journey? It was nice, thank you. She spoke so softly, he could barely hear her. The girls are very excited to meet you. They've talked about nothing but getting a new mama for weeks. I'm glad. She didn't look at him, choosing to stare down at her hands instead. I thought about bringing them with me, but it's a long drive, so I left them with my parents last night. I'm excited to meet them. She really wished he would have brought them. She would have felt a great deal more comfortable with the children there. She had no idea what to say to a man. She wasn't sure she'd ever been alone with a man before, so she felt out of her element. She'd been so quiet and shy during her school years, she'd never even had a beau. It was easier for her that way. So you were a cook back east? He navigated the busy streets skillfully, happy to see they were almost out of town. He should be able to hear her better once they didn't have the noise from the city around them. Yes. Were you a cook in a restaurant? How many questions could he ask before he ran out of things to say? Surely, she'd respond to something with more than one sentence. No, for a family in town. What type of food can you cook? She shrugged. I never really thought about it. Just normal food, I guess. Finally, they were away from the noise of the city. Normal food? Do you cook any Norwegian foods? He knew his mother would be much happier if she could at least cook Norwegian dishes. I couldn't even tell you what dishes are Norwegian. What are some Norwegian foods? He glanced at her in surprise. Rakfisk, lutefisk, siltalab, smalahove, pickled herring? At her blank stare, he chuckled. Well, maybe Mor can teach you to cook Norwegian. Mor? It's the Norwegian word for mother. What nationality are you? Maybe he could get her talking about her heritage. He didn't want to make the long drive back home with her sitting in total silence. Talking to Anna had never been an effort. Maybe Mor was right and he was making a big mistake. She shrugged. Irish, French and English, I believe. So your family has been here for a long time, I take it? So much for that potential conversation. What could he possibly persuade her to talk about? Was she this shy with everyone, or was it simply because she knew they'd be married in a few hours? Yes. Yours? My parents immigrated here from Norway. They live near you? She knew he was trying to get her to talk with him, but she was having a hard time knowing what to say. She was always shy, but this was the worst it had ever been. Her mother had explained about the wedding night to her, and knowing she'd be doing that with him in just a few hours was nerve-wracking. He nodded. All of my family is in Minnesota. Most are close. He liked having family nearby. Do you have a big family? I have 7 brothers and 4 sisters. Her eyes widened. And they're all close enough that I'll meet them soon? She tried to keep the dread from her voice. She hoped they wouldn't all be there for the wedding. She didn't think she could handle meeting that many new people all on one day. It was hard enough just meeting him and the girls. Yes, you'll meet most of them this evening at the wedding supper. Wedding supper? You had time to plan a wedding supper? Why had she pictured him and the girls with her for the wedding and them all standing in front of the preacher together? She hadn't seen this as a normal wedding with a big group of people. How was she going to handle being the center of attention that way? She felt the panic rising in her throat again, but tried to hide how very afraid she was of the idea. It's just going to be at my parents' house. Nothing formal and just family. Why was she nervous about meeting his family? Surely she'd realized he and his girls wouldn't be isolated with no family around. That's a lot of people, though. Sounds like your family is the entire state of Minnesota. He laughed. Not even close. There are a lot of us, though. I'm the youngest, so you'll meet lots of brothers and sisters and nephews and nieces today. Now that she was actually talking to him, she didn't seem to be so bad. How many brothers and sisters do you have? I'm an only child. My father died when I was 2, and my mother never remarried. She's getting married next month, though. She stared out at the scenery as they drove through the countryside. She was surprised by how pretty Minnesota was. The carriage was small enough they were pressed together from shoulder to hip. She wished she could move a respectable distance away, but they'd be married in a few hours, so it probably didn't matter too much except in her mind. He hadn't been sure how he'd react physically to his bride, but he found he liked the way she was pressed against him. At first, he hadn't liked her appearance, simply because it was so different from Anna's, but the more time he spent with her, the more he realized that he was looking forward to his wedding night. Is that why you answered my letter? She nodded. My mother's fiancé didn't like the idea of having me there after the wedding. It was either become a mail-order bride or find a family who would hire me as a live-in servant. My experience with the family I've been working for made me decide I'd rather be a mail-order bride. What happened with them? She thought for a moment about the best way to answer him. I've been working for the same family for the past 3 years. I was hired to be a cook, but it's gradually become more and more. For the past few months, I've been expected to cook not only 3 meals per day, but also do all the dusting and cleaning and take care of the 2 children. None of that would bother me if my pay had risen with my duties. If they'd paid me for everything I'd done, I'd have been able to find a place to live and support myself. She sighed. I was looking for a different position in the local paper when my mother told me about her marriage. He thought about what she'd told him. You were right to get out of that situation. I'm glad you came out here to be part of our family. He took her hand, which was resting on her lap, and squeezed it in his own. She felt her hand tingling where he held it. She looked down and saw how huge his hand was compared to hers and felt overwhelmed again. He dwarfed her in every way. Tell me about the bacon sandwiches. She wondered how it would be to kiss a man who was so much bigger than her. Or any man for that matter. Was it wrong to think about kissing him? They would be married in a few hours, so maybe it was okay. He laughed. Bacon is about the only thing I can cook. Moore brings bread into town for us every other day or so, and will usually bring a meal with her. If she doesn't bring enough food to last until her next visit, the girls are stuck with eating bread and jam or bacon sandwiches. I just made bacon sandwiches again right before my girls and I sat down to write that letter. It was just as she'd guessed. So your girls would give just about anything to never have to eat another bacon sandwich? If they were that sick of bacon, they would love her on sight. Even in her modesty, she knew she was an excellent cook. The comments she received from the dinner parties she'd cooked for had left her in no doubt about that. He shrugged. The younger one especially. She's got more spirit in her. The older one thanks me sweetly every time I put anything on the table. And that worried him. He knew Abby was as sick of bacon sandwiches as he and Georgie were, but she seemed almost afraid to say anything about it. Emily actually reminded him a bit of Abby. They sound like lovely children. I can't wait to meet them. Even though she was nervous about being a wife and about meeting his family, she was excited at the prospect of having two little girls to love. They've been calling you their email order mama ever since you answered the letter. I hope they'll shorten it to just a mama after we marry, but I'm not certain they will. He felt the need to warn her there could be some slips from the girls. I won't mind either way. They can even call me Emily until they feel more comfortable with something else. He shook his head. No, that wouldn't be respectful. They drove along in silence for a few minutes, and she realized he was still holding her hand. She found she didn't mind at all. It felt good to be touched. By the time they reached his town, she was happy to see the buildings rising before them. She had never been much of a conversationalist, and had found it difficult to keep up her end of the conversation with the handsome stranger sitting beside her. He pointed out his mercantile with the huge sign reading, Benjamin's Bargains. Do you get a lot of business? She asked. I'm the only mercantile in town and all the surrounding farmers shop at my store. I do a good business. He looked over at her. I'll be asking for your help from time to time. Maybe a couple of hours in the afternoon, or taking a whole day here and there. The girls are good at staying out of trouble while I work. He pulled up in front of a small house just down from the church. I thought we were on our way to get married. He nodded and walked around the buggy, helping her down. We are. My sister said to bring you to her house first. She insisted you'd need to take a bath after so many days on the train and you might need help with your hair. He pulled his pocket watch out and looked at it. We have just over an hour before the wedding. He reached into the back and pulled her bag out, carrying it for her up to the small house. He knocked on the door and a tall blonde woman opened it. Brigitta, this is my bride, Emily. Emily, my sister, Brigitta. Emily smiled, glad to meet one of his siblings before the others, so she wouldn't be as overwhelmed later. It's nice to meet you. She knew her voice had dropped to a mere whisper again. Brigitta's eyes met Benjamin's over Emily's head. She's tiny. She opened her door wide. Come in. Come in. We must get you ready for your wedding. She pointed her finger at Benjamin. You go away. We'll see you at the church. Go make sure Moore has your pretty girls ready. Benjamin squeezed Emily's arm. Don't let my sister bully you. He turned and walked toward his store, his strides long and hurried. Emily watched him go, and then turned to Brigitta. I'm filthy. I can't believe how dirty the train was. She was embarrassed to meet anyone looking like she did, so she was thankful it was just one person. It was bad enough to meet Benjamin like this. Brigitta wrapped her arm around Emily's shoulders. I have a bath waiting for you in the kitchen. I just need to add hot water, and it's already boiling. She steered Emily toward the kitchen and added the hot water. You can go ahead and take your clothes off. I have daughters and sisters, and you won't bother me. I'll wash your hair for you. Emily had never taken off her clothes in front of anyone but her mother, but she was afraid to say no to the older woman. She stripped quickly and sank into the warm water. Dropping to her knees beside the tub, Brigitta used a glass and poured it over Emily's head and then scrubbed it with soap. After she finished washing Emily's hair, she scrubbed her back for her. Emily sighed. No one had washed her back for her since she was a small child. That feels nice. Thank you. After a moment, Brigitta stood up. I wish I could let you soak for an hour, but we need to get you ready for your wedding. She walked over to the work table and got a towel she'd placed there earlier. She held it out and turned her head so she could wrap it around Emily without making her uncomfortable. You dry off, and I'll be right back. I want to get a couple of things for you. While she was gone, Emily dressed hurriedly in her chemise. She pulled her dress, which had been carefully wrapped in tissue paper, out of her bag and spread it out on the table. It didn't look terribly wrinkled, so she pulled it over her head. She buttoned it up the back, just finishing up as Brigitte came back into the room. Brigitte held a small bouquet of white and pink flowers. She had 2 single white flowers in her hand. "I thought you might like to carry this bouquet, and we can put these 2 in your hair." Emily smiled, utterly charmed by the details Brigitte was thinking of. "Oh, thank you. I'd love to wear them." She took one of the single flowers and held it under her nose to smell it. "What kind of flower is this?" "They're asters. There aren't a lot of flowers still in bloom this time of year in Minnesota. They're perfect. Thank you for thinking of them." Emily was glad she'd have a piece of Benjamin's home with her as she walked down the aisle toward him. "Your dress is lovely. If you sit, I'll fix your hair for you." Emily sat down on one of the straight-back wooden chairs in the kitchen. Each one had a cushion made in a red check pattern that matched the pretty tablecloth. Looking around the kitchen for the first time, Emily found it lovely. The curtains matched the tablecloth, and there were small paintings on the walls. "I like the way you've decorated your kitchen." "Thank you." She used Emily's brush and comb to quickly comb through her hair and deftly applied pins to put it into an updo. She added a flower to one side and tilted her head to the side to look at her. "I think you'll look better with just the one flower in your hair. Is that okay with you?" Emily nodded. "That's fine." Brigitte took a small hand mirror from the table where she'd laid it and held it up for Emily. "What do you think?" Emily stared at her reflection in the mirror for a moment. "I love it." She really did like how it looked, but she knew she'd have lied and said she liked it even if she hadn't. She'd do anything to keep from offending this sweet woman who had gone so far out of her way to make her happy and comfortable. "You look beautiful. My brother will swallow his tongue when he sees you walking through the church toward him." Emily knew better. Benjamin was looking for a mother for his daughters, nothing more. She looked at the clock on the wall. "We only have 10 minutes. Shouldn't we go?" "Yes, we need to leave. It's a short walk to the church, but it wouldn't do to be late for your own wedding." She went into the parlor and called out, "Dalla, Adam, Edna, Jarl, it's time to go." 4 tall blonde teens, 2 boys and 2 girls ran into the room, all dressed in their Sunday best clothes. "These are my children. The girls are Dalla and Edna, and the boys are Jarl and Adam." She opened the door and the children walked ahead to the church. "Isn't your husband going to the wedding?" "Lars is the pastor. He's already there." "Oh. I didn't realize you were the pastor's wife. How could she live up to being in the same family as a pastor? Wouldn't people be watching her more closely?" "Yes, that's my lot in life." She smiled as they walked slowly toward the church. "He was a simple farmer when I married him and had my babies. 10 years ago, he told me he needed to answer the Lord's call." "How did you feel about it?" "Overwhelmed at first, but I think I've found my place." They stepped into the back of the church. "Our church doubles as our schoolhouse." She looked at Emily and fixed a stray tendril of hair before hugging her. "I'm so glad to be getting a new sister. I'm going to go take my seat. Wait until you hear the music." Emily felt very alone at the back of the church. She wished she didn't have to walk down the aisle alone, but she'd have had to do that if she'd married back home as well. There were no men who had been father figures to her. She took deep, steady breaths, trying to calm her nerves. She hated being the center of attention. After a moment, she heard the music start, and slowly walked around the corner and started walking up the aisle toward Benjamin. She saw 2 little blonde heads in the front row peering at her with huge smiles, and assumed they were the girls. They were sitting with an older woman who stared straight ahead, not even turning around to see the bride. She walked straight to the front and took her place next to Benjamin. He smiled down at her as Lars, the pastor, cleared his throat and began speaking. Emily let the familiar words wash over her. She'd not been to a great deal of weddings, but several of her school friends had married and she'd attended. Everything passed in a blur and she was asked to face Benjamin. Benjamin spoke his vows in a strong voice that carried throughout the church. When it was Emily's turn, she mumbled the words. Benjamin pushed a ring onto her finger and leaned down to kiss her for the first time. Lars pronounced them man and wife and introduced them to the assembled crowd as Mr. and Mrs. Johnson. Emily faced the audience, trying not to make eye contact with anyone. After a moment, she was nearly knocked over by the two blonde girls she'd noticed on her way up the aisle. She squatted down in her dress to meet them for the first time. "I'm Emily," she told them in her soft voice. "You're our mail-order mama." The girl who spoke was the younger, so she immediately assumed she was Georgie. "You must be Georgie," Emily told her, smiling at the young girl. Georgie nodded and pointed to her sister. "That's Abby. We're really glad you're here. I'm so happy to meet you both." They hugged her again, and she stood back up next to Benjamin, urging the girls to stand with them. Benjamin smiled down at her. "Thank you for making them part of our wedding. They're our children. Of course, they're part of the wedding." She squeezed the hand of the older girl who was standing at her side. She had recognized the look of shyness on the girl's face and was pleased she'd be able to relate well to one of them. The four of them walked to the back of the church together, several people stopping Benjamin to shake his hand along the way. He introduced her to each of the people, but she knew she'd never remember their names. They went out to the buggy and he helped her in and put the girls in the back seat. "We're going to Moore's for the wedding supper. The girls will spend the night with my parents tonight, and we'll pick them up in the morning before I open the store at 10. Emily swallowed hard at the thought of their wedding night. She wasn't yet ready to think about it, though, so she sat silently on the drive out to his parents' farm. "How long will it take to get there?" she asked after a while. "It's a 30-minute drive," he told her. "I almost wish I hadn't agreed to a wedding supper after being on the road all day, but I thought you'd want to celebrate our wedding." He looked over at her as she watched the scenery. "You'd rather have skipped it, wouldn't you?" She nodded. "It's okay, though. I'm just not good at meeting large groups of people all at once. I'm sorry. I should have waited and asked you." He pulled the buggy in front of a large farmhouse. "Here we are. I lived here until I married Anna." He walked around and helped her down while the girls scrambled down on their own. Abby walked over and slipped her small hand into Emily's. "I'll help you meet everyone." Emily smiled. "Thank you, Abby." Emily was glad Abby was so much quieter than the rest of her large Norwegian family. Emily and Abby walked into the house hand in hand. Abby led her straight to the woman who had refused to look at her in the church. "Farmore, this is our new mama, Emily." Abby stood looking between the two women as if she expected something bad to happen. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Johnson. Is there anything I can help you with?" Emily was proud of how steady she kept her voice. Every time she met someone new, it was an effort to keep her voice loud enough to be heard. Her new mother-in-law rounded on Emily, a scowl on her face. "Not unless you know about Norwegian cooking. Do you?" Her voice sounded angry. Emily swallowed hard, determined to get along with her new mother-in-law. "No, ma'am, but I'd be happy to learn. Just stay out of the way." Ingrid turned back to her stove and the strong odors coming from it. Emily looked to see if anyone other than Abby had noticed the exchange, but no one appeared to be paying any attention. The house was filled with blonde Norwegians, and Emily felt out of place with her brunette hair. She moved out of the way as she'd been asked and went to speak to Birgitta, Abby still clinging to her hand. Birgitta introduced her to several of her siblings, none of whom Emily would later remember. She'd need to meet them one at a time to remember names and faces. Today, she was simply overwhelmed by them all. Everyone was polite with the single exception of her mother-in-law. She refused to let it bother her, though. The woman simply didn't know her, and once she did, she'd come around. She had to. She sat next to Benjamin for the meal, and once Lars had said the prayer for all of them, they ate the huge meal. She was only able to eat a few bites, but managed to make it look like more by pushing the food around on her plate. She didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings by not eating the food they'd cooked, but she was so nervous, her throat felt like it was closing up. When it came time to cut the wedding cake, she glanced up at Benjamin as they held the knife together. They sliced through the cake and cut small slices for each of them. Emily took her fork and carefully fed a bite of the cake to Benjamin as she'd seen done at a wedding back home. When Benjamin returned the favor, she forced herself to chew, but the cake tasted like sawdust to her. Abby was still staying within a few feet of Emily at all times, obviously afraid her new mama was going to run off somewhere. It was hours before the party finally ended, but it all passed in a blur for Emily. She talked to the girls as much as she could while Benjamin laughed and joked with his brothers. Emily would look up from time to time and always find Benjamin's eyes on her. She would blush and look down, paying attention to whomever was speaking to her. Once the guests had thinned out, Benjamin led Emily and the girls outside. "It's time for us to go home. We'll be back to get you first thing in the morning," Benjamin promised the girls. Abby reached out to cling to Emily's hand. "Can't we come home with you?" Benjamin shook his head, squatting down until he was eye level with his older daughter. "I'll take good care of your new mama. I promise. I don't want her to go away." The fear of losing her new mother was apparent in Abby's voice. Emily hugged the child to her. "I'm not going anywhere. I came all this way on a train to be your mama. How could I leave now before we've had a chance to do anything fun together? I haven't gotten to read to you or bake you a cake or cookies. We haven't even been on a picnic or a walk through the woods. We're going to do all those things just as soon as we can. Okay?" Abby stared up at Emily in the darkness. "You promise?" Emily stroked her cheek. "I promise." Emily knew she had her work cut out for her as she helped this little girl get over her fear of losing her. How could she explain to her that even if she had somewhere else to go, she wouldn't leave her? "Me too?" Georgie asked, obviously not concerned, just wanting to be included. "We can't do anything fun without you, Georgie," Emily told the younger girl, hugging her as well. She looked back at Abby. "Are you okay?" She really hated the idea of leaving the little girl, not only for her, though. She was afraid of the wedding night, and knew if the girls were there, she could make an excuse to sit by Abby's bed during the night. Abby nodded. "Tomorrow we'll have all day together? I need to write 2 letters tomorrow, but I have nothing else planned for the whole day, except making a supper that is not bacon sandwiches. Will you girls help me with that?" Abby giggled. "We've had bacon sandwiches a lot since Mama died." She covered her mouth with her hand. "I'm sorry." Emily shook her head, understanding immediately. "You had a mama before me you loved very much. You can talk to me about her anytime you want to. I'll even help you take flowers to her grave if you want." Abby flung her arms around Emily. "I'm so glad we picked you to be our new mama." Emily bowed her head low over Abby's and kissed the top of her head. "So am I." And she was. Being their mama was something she had been looking forward to. Being Benjamin's wife was the scary part. Benjamin cleared his throat. "It's time for us to go. We'll be here early tomorrow morning. Be good for your farmor." "We're always good," Georgie told him as he helped Emily into the buggy for the drive home. "We'll see you tomorrow, Papa and mail order Mama." "It's just Mama," Abby corrected in a loud whisper.
"Bye,
"Mama," Georgie yelled. "Good night, Mama and Papa," Abby told them, waving as they drove away. As soon as they were on the road, Benjamin took Emily's hand in his. Thank you so much for making my daughters feel so important. It means everything to me. As the day had progressed, she'd become prettier and prettier to him. He was sure it was the way she'd acted toward his daughters. Our daughters are important. I hated leaving them there. For more reasons than one. I know, but you and I need at least one night alone together. He slipped his arm around her shoulders and pulled her closer to him on the buggy seat. Did I tell you how beautiful you look in your wedding gown? She shook her head, staring up at him in wonder. Well, you do. You're a beautiful bride. Abby was right. I'm really glad we chose you to be our mail order mama. Emily blushed but laughed softly. Your girls are wonderful. I'm really looking forward to getting to know them better. He looked down at her in the light of the full moon. What about me? Are you looking forward to getting to know me better? She bit her lip, afraid he was talking about having marital relations with her that evening. I'm nervous about getting to know you better, she finally said, honestly. There's nothing to be nervous about. He kept his voice soft and gentle, determined not to frighten off his shy bride. When he'd courted Anna, she'd been as eager for love-making as he was. They'd spent hours kissing and hugging and holding hands. They'd stroked one another until they were both desperate to be together. By the time they finally married, she had fallen eagerly into his arms. Emily's shyness was something he hadn't bargained for, but he had always had strong needs, and he wasn't going to put off his wedding night just because his bride had a strong case of the jitters. Chapter 4. After pulling the buggy in front of his house, Benjamin jumped down to help Emily to the ground. He opened the door and led her up the stairs. The store was on the ground floor, and the back stairs behind the store led up to their house. The house was still a 2-story home, but it simply started with the second level. He showed her the kitchen, parlor and dining room first, and then led her up the stairs. It was built this way so we could live on the same property the store resides on. I like to be close to the store, because I feel like it stays safer this way. The girls can be left alone in the house during the day, because really, I'm still here. It's nice. She looked around at the pretty decorations on the walls and knew she'd be in no hurry to change anything. Anna had done a beautiful job with this house. He opened the door to a guest bedroom first. This room is just an extra. We'd hoped to have enough children to fill the whole place, but it never happened. There was sadness in his voice as he said the words. I'm sorry. She never got pregnant after Georgie? She was pregnant when she died. She got scarlet fever in her 5th month and just never recovered. The rest of us had it too, but it didn't affect us like it did her. I'm so sorry. Her hand reached for his and squeezed it. It was the first time she'd touched him voluntarily, and it felt strange to her, but good. Thank you. He led her to the next room and opened the door. It was a little girl's room. There was a pretty quilt on the bed along with a rag doll. A painting of a flower graced the wall. This is Abby's room. If you ever forget which room belongs to which child, Abby's room is always spotless with everything put away and her bed made perfectly. On the other hand, he opened the door to Georgie's room and Emily couldn't help but let out a quick laugh. Georgie's not quite so neat, is she? Georgie's room had the same pretty quilt on it, but hers was rumpled terribly. Her rag doll, identical to her sister's, was standing on its head on the dresser. There was a nightgown on the floor, half under the bed. There was a painting of a stream in front of a forest on the wall, but it was askew, making the unkempt look even more obvious. This is actually very neat for Georgie. She made a real effort to make it look nice for you. Benjamin's eyes were twinkling as he spoke, acknowledging his younger daughter's flaw with amusement. Emily's eyes met Benjamin's and she grinned. I guess neatness will be one of the first things I work on with her. It was nice to have a place to start. She wondered what she would find to be Abby's biggest flaw. It's going to have to be. He led her to the next room and opened the door wide. This is our room. I cleared out the top 2 drawers for you. He dropped her bag on the bed. If you need more space, just let me know. Thank you. I'm sure that will be more than enough. She smiled ruefully at her bag with all her belongings in it. There was so little she had, she could probably make do with half a drawer. You can pick out some fabric from the store tomorrow so you can make some more dresses. He guessed correctly what she was thinking as he eyed her small bag. She smiled her thanks. I appreciate it. I'm sorry I came so ill-prepared. If I'd had another week or 2, I could have had some dresses finished before I came. She wondered if he thought less of her for having so little. She hoped not, but there was little she could do about it now if he did. She'd just have to work extra hard to get some dresses made up as quickly as possible. You'll have plenty of time now to work on them. The girls need to be taught to sew anyway. She looked around the room and saw the furniture looked sturdy. There was a large bed that she tried not to stare at, as well as a dresser and a good-sized armoire. In the corner was a rocking chair. She walked over to it and ran her hand across the seat. He followed her and sat down on the bed. With him sitting and her standing, she was only slightly taller than him. What had she been thinking marrying a man who was so much larger than she was? He could hurt her so easily. He caught her hand and pulled her toward him and down onto his lap. He cupped the back of her head with his hand and brought her lips to his. His tongue automatically traced the seam of her lips, and she wasn't sure what he was trying to do. She kept her mouth tightly closed and her hands on his shoulders to steady herself. Open your mouth for me, he whispered against her lips. What? There was shock in her tone, but he didn't respond, simply slid his tongue into her open mouth. He nipped her bottom lip with his teeth while his tongue explored hers. She'd never been kissed before their wedding, and it had never occurred to her a man would want to put his tongue in her mouth as he kissed her. She stayed rigid against him for a moment before relaxing into his embrace, her hands moving around to his back and stroking the muscles through his suit jacket. His hands went around her back and he unbuttoned her to the waist, his hands exploring her body through her chemise. After a moment, he pulled back, his breathing heavy. I'm going to go out and take care of the horses while you get ready for bed. He put her on her feet and she swayed a little but grabbed the armoire to steady herself. Why had his kiss made her so weak in the knees? She'd never felt anything like that before. Of course, she'd never been kissed before today either, so maybe kissing was supposed to leave her weak in the knees. He stood and left the room, and she heard the front door close behind him. She was in a daze as she put her clothes away in the drawers and changed into her nightgown. She left her dirty dress in her carpet bag with plans to see if anything else needed to be washed. By the time she heard the door open again, she'd worked herself into a frenzy, worried about what was going to happen. Her mother had explained how a man consummated a marriage, but she'd pictured a normal-sized man. She couldn't imagine lying down and letting Benjamin lie on top of her. He'd crush her with his bulk. He wasn't fat, he was merely tall and muscular, and she was convinced she was too small to ever mate with a man of his size. Surely if she mentioned that to him he'd understand. She was lying in the bed with the covers tucked under her chin when he walked into the room, and by the tension in her body, he could see that his attempts to relax her by kissing her before he left to put the horses up hadn't worked. She was more nervous than ever. He sighed and turned off the lamp, wishing she would let him look at her, but he knew it was out of the question. It would make her even more nervous. He quickly undressed, happy that his body was hidden from her, not because he was embarrassed, but because he was fully aroused, and he was certain if she saw him now, she would be in a full-blown panic. He slipped between the sheets and lay on his side facing her, his chin propped up by one of his hands. His other hand stroked her cheek until she turned her face toward him. There's nothing to worry about. I need you to trust me. His voice was low and gravelly. She shivered at his touch. I'm sorry, I'm so nervous. I've never done anything like this before. He smiled in the dark. It was funny she felt the need to tell him it was her first time. It was obvious she'd never been touched by a man in any way before. I know. He leaned down and brushed his lips across hers again, but this time when his tongue flicked her lips, she knew to open her mouth for him. She kept a tight grip on the sheets to keep them pulled up to her neck. Instead of trying to fight her over the sheet, he concentrated on kissing her, doing his best to calm her fears. His hand stroked her cheek as his tongue tangled with hers. After a moment, she relaxed her grip on the covers as she got caught up in kissing her new husband. She rolled to her side so she could move closer to him, not realizing what she was doing. He took the opportunity to trail his fingers from her cheek down over the covers to her hip. He pulled her closer to him as he stroked her body through the layers of blankets. His hand cupped her bottom and pulled her even closer so they were touching from chest to hips. Emily felt a tingling all through her body, starting from her lips and spreading down through her extremities. She'd never felt anything like it, but she knew immediately she liked it. How could he make her feel that way? Benjamin pulled his lips from hers to brush them against her cheek. He'd missed being with a woman so much, it was all he could do to keep going slowly. "Are you cold?" he asked softly. She pulled her head back for a moment, a little startled by the question. "No, not at all." He smiled, and pushed all but the sheet off of her and down to the foot of the bed. "Good. We can get rid of some of these excess blankets then." Her eyes widened as she realized she was now only covered by her thin white nightgown and a sheet. His hand slid under the sheet and stroked her from her shoulder to her elbow through her nightgown. "You're so small. Was Anna bigger than me?" He nodded, not wanting to compare the two women, but he'd been unable to get his late wife off his mind. "Much. She was taller than Brigitte." Emily was surprised to hear that. She'd never met a woman as tall as his sister before. She couldn't help but wonder if he wished she was a tall blonde like he was used to. She didn't ask, though, she just looked at him in the dark with her wide blue eyes. "I feel like you're going to break if I touch you," he whispered. She'd been worried about that herself at first, but when he said it, it made her feel as if he didn't think she was good enough. "I'm not going to break. I'm strong." To show her courage, she lifted her hand and ran her fingers along his cheek, feeling the stubble there. She trailed her fingers down to his neck, and moved her hand around behind it to cup it and pull his mouth to hers again. She didn't know where the boldness had come from, but she liked his kiss and she wanted him to kiss her again. This time when he kissed her, his mouth was more insistent against hers. She responded eagerly, her tongue tracing the inside of his lip. His hand moved down the back of her nightgown to her bottom, pulling her fully against him, this time with no covers blocking him. She felt his erection prodding her belly and pulled back in surprise. "It's normal," he whispered, pulling her back to him for another deep kiss. He kept one hand curled under his head while the other slowly stroked her back, buttocks and thighs. After a moment, his hand came around to cup her breast through her nightgown. He was surprised to find it so full. She was so little, but she was perfectly proportioned. He wanted to remove her nightgown, but knew she wasn't ready for that yet, so he stroked her through the thin fabric. She felt a pressure building in her center, and wondered if she was supposed to feel a sort of pain there. She couldn't ask him, though, so she just pressed closer to him, feeling strange as if she were doing something wrong when she felt him poking into her stomach. He pushed against her shoulder and she rolled to her back, looking up at the blonde head looming over her. His mouth dropped to hers again, and she moved her hands to his shoulders, holding on tight. It was then she realized he'd gone to bed without putting a nightshirt on. Did he always sleep without his clothes? Was he wearing his underwear, or was he completely naked under the cover? She wanted to run her hand down his back to find out, but found she didn't have the courage. He reached down and caught the bottom of her nightgown, bringing it up as he stroked his hand from her ankle to her thigh. He hoped he could convince her to stop wearing nightgowns altogether, but he didn't think it would be an easy task with his shy bride. Once her nightgown was bunched up around her hips, he went to work on the buttons at the front of her gown. He knew there were at least 3, but couldn't tell if there were more in the dark. He slowly unbuttoned the three he knew of and felt for more, never breaking their kiss. He didn't want to frighten her, but he needed to get her out of her nightgown so he could explore her fully. She didn't realize his hands were on her buttons until he'd freed the fifth, and last, one and slid his hand into her open gown. His fingers cupped her breast and she let out a soft moan into his mouth. He toyed with her nipple, making it peak. "Your skin is so soft." Her hands started moving as if of their own volition over his back, rubbing the strong muscles there. She marveled at the difference in their bodies. His was hard, where hers was soft. She could have laid in the dark touching him all night, but knew he'd want more from their wedding night than that. His hands moved from one breast to the other, touching her with his calloused fingers. He was feeling more and more frustrated by her nightgown. Finally, he knelt at her side and helped her sit up. "Let's get this off you, sweetheart." He lifted her gown over her head and threw it to the floor, pushing her back down onto the bed on her back. She wanted to pull the sheet up over her body, but knew he had the right to see her and touch her any way he wanted. What was she thinking, giving a man who must be twice her weight permission to do what he wanted with her? She felt the panic begin to rise again just before he lowered his mouth back to hers. His fingers danced over her bare skin, along her stomach and breasts, before dropping lower and stroking his fingers through the triangle of hair shielding her innocence. She jumped at the feel of his fingers there. Her mother hadn't mentioned he would do all this touching. Why wasn't he just consummating the marriage like her mother said he would? "I don't think you're supposed to touch me there," she whispered in embarrassment. "Does it feel good?" His fingers drifted down and touched the nub hidden inside her folds. She jerked in surprise, but couldn't bite back a moan. "Does it?" She nodded, too embarrassed to talk about how he was making her feel. This had to be wrong, didn't it? He seemed to read her mind. "Nothing that feels good, that we both like, is wrong for us. God made me to enjoy your body, and He made you to enjoy it, too. Stop thinking so much, and just enjoy what I'm doing to you." He covered her mouth in another kiss as one finger slid into her passage. How was she supposed to stop thinking about it? Everything he did was foreign and strange and felt like she shouldn't be doing it with anyone, even her husband. When he started moving his finger in and out of her slowly, she got her answer. Suddenly all thoughts were gone, and she was just a creature of sensation. His movements felt so good. They made her feel better and want something more all at once. What was it? After a moment, he added another finger, moving them in and out while his tongue did incredible things to hers. She wanted to scream at him to finish, but what was it she needed him to finish? Finally, she felt as if something popped inside her and all the tension left her as she rose her hips up toward his hand. He moved his fingers in and out a few more times, before rolling onto her completely. He was braced above her on his elbows, his face seeming pained in the darkness. She stared up at him, uncertain what had just happened, but too relaxed to care. She felt something much larger than his fingers pushing against her, knowing it must be his man part her mother had said he would put inside her. She laid perfectly still, waiting for him to hurt her with it, just like her mother had said he would. He pressed it into her just a tiny bit, and it didn't hurt. It simply felt strange. He pulled back and pushed in again, this time going further, but still not hurting her. Maybe he wouldn't hurt her at all. She relaxed a little as he pulled out and then thrust in hard, pushing inside her until he let out a loud groan. She let out another moan, this time one of pain. It did hurt. She pushed against his shoulders, trying to get him off of her. Her mother had said she needed to lie still beneath him and it would be over soon, but she didn't want to lie still. She wanted him to get off of her and pull it out. "You're hurting me." Her voice didn't sound like her own. It was breathless and held just a hint of a whimper. "Please stop." Benjamin groaned, forcing his body to remain still inside hers. "I'm sorry." He dropped a kiss to her lips, trying to help her find the passion again. He knew he wouldn't be able to remain still for long. She kept pushing at his shoulders. She wanted to tell him to get off her, but she couldn't bring herself to be quite that rude. She lay under him instead, taking panting breaths, hoping he'd just stop and forget about doing this. He stroked her cheek. "You're so beautiful. Do you have any idea how much pleasure you're bringing me?" He was determined to calm her and finish. There was no way he could pull out now, and he wasn't sure how long he could remain still. "Really? Really? Being inside you feels so good to me. I want to move inside you." "Why?" She knew the question would show how little she knew about what they were doing, but she didn't care. He needed to understand she had to know what was happening to her. He swallowed hard, trying to keep in mind how innocent she was. "Do you remember how good my fingers felt when they were moving in and out of you?" "We shouldn't talk about that." How could he bring that up now? "Yes, we should. It felt really good, didn't it?" She nodded slightly, feeling the blush creep up her neck to her face. "Well, that's how this is going to feel, only better. You just have to get used to it." "But it hurts," she protested. How could he want her to let him do something that hurt her this way? Didn't he care that she was in pain? "Does it still hurt?" She took stock before answering him. "Not nearly as much." "Good." He brought his hips back quickly and plunged back inside her. Her breath caught as she let out a slight squeal. "Did it hurt that time?" "No. It felt strange. For now, I'll settle for not hurting you." He kissed her quickly, nipping her bottom lip. "Get ready for strange." He kept his movement slow and gentle as he moved in and out of her tight passage. It was obvious to him it didn't feel as good to her as his fingers had, but she was no longer protesting his movements. It had been so long since he'd been with a woman that he didn't last long. After a moment, he cried out and collapsed onto his elbows atop her. His breathing was harsh as he buried his face in her neck. Emily lay beneath him, running her hands up and down his back. She was glad she'd pleased him, even if she'd felt the act was lacking somehow. Her mother had promised her it would get better with time, and she hoped her mother was correct about that. Still, it hadn't been so bad she wouldn't be willing to do it with him again if he ever wanted to. She couldn't help but wonder how often he'd want to do it, though. Maybe once a month? Or less often? Her brow furrowed. She could handle it that often if he needed it. After a moment, he rolled to his side and reached down to drag the covers over both of them. They were hot now, but once the sweat on their bodies cooled, they'd be shivering in the cold. He lay facing her, not sure what to say now that it was over. What did one say to a wife he'd just met a few hours before after taking her virginity? She rolled to her side away from him, snuggling into the blanket. She'd had so little sleep since his letter had arrived. Now that she was here, and the pressure was off, she fell asleep. Benjamin was still trying to figure out what he should say to her when he realized she'd fallen asleep. Maybe flowery words weren't necessary for his little bride. He yawned and settled against the pillow, joining her in sleep. If they woke early enough, maybe they could enjoy one another some more before they had to go get the children. Asterisk. Benjamin woke early, wondering why he felt so totally relaxed. After a moment he remembered and smiled. She's why. He glanced over at the pillow beside his and saw his new bride sleeping with her head cradled on her hands. She looked even younger in his sleep, which made him feel a pang of guilt. She'd shown more passion than he'd expected, and he looked forward to further awakening her to the pleasures of the marriage bed. He glanced at the clock he kept on the dresser and saw it was only 6:30. That gave him plenty of time to give his new bride another lesson in lovemaking. He smiled at the very idea. She may be tiny, but she was passionate, and he was thrilled with her pretty little body. He leaned over and smoothed her hair away from her face, gently caressing her cheek. When she didn't respond, he rolled closer, nibbling the side of her neck which was exposed. Emily blinked as she felt a tickling on the side of her neck. She put her hand up to push away whatever was there and encountered a head. Startled, she yelped. Benjamin chuckled. Did you forget your husband was sharing your bed? Emily blushed. Good morning. She couldn't admit to him that she had forgotten she'd married. She'd fully expected to open her eyes and find herself back home in her bed at her mother's house. Good morning, wife. He turned her toward him and dropped his mouth to hers to kiss her softly. How did you sleep? After 4 nights of sleeping on a train, I just slept. I don't even remember dreaming. She stretched her legs under the covers, wishing she had the courage to stretch her arms above her head, but she knew she couldn't, because she wasn't wearing a nightgown. You nodded off pretty fast last night. I'm sorry you were so tired. His hand rubbed up and down her arm. Her eyes met his before dropping again. Now that it was daylight, she was too embarrassed to look him in the eye. It was a long journey. How could she have been so brazen? Was she really not wearing her nightgown? He brushed another kiss against her lips, his hands rubbing her shoulders. We have an hour or two before we need to leave to pick up the girls. He pulled her flush against him, his erection against her thigh, leaving her in no doubt about what he wanted to do to fill the time. He couldn't really want to do that in the daylight, could he? He'd have to see her with no clothes on. I guess I should fix breakfast then, she said, trying to distract him. I have a better idea. His lips caught hers again, much more insistently this time. One hand cupped her breast and he flicked his thumb across the tip. His other hand rubbed her bare thigh, slowly slipping between her legs. Benjamin. The sun is up, she protested. Surely he didn't really think she'd agree to have relations with him in the light of day. He had to know that was wrong. He laughed. The sun isn't the only thing up. He took her hand and brought it down to his erection, laughing as she pulled her hand away as if she'd been burned. Let's make love. He pushed her to her back, his hand moving deliberately into her soft folds, trying to get her ready for him. We can't do this when it's light out. Her protest was softer this time as she tilted her head to the side to give his lips access to her neck once more. There's not a single scripture in the Bible that says it's wrong to make love in the daylight. I promise. I've looked. His probing fingers found her dampness and he smiled. No matter how much she protested, she was ready for him. He rolled atop her to settle between her thighs. You'll like it a lot more this time. She was startled at his abrupt movements and even more surprised to feel his male member pressing against her soft opening. As soon as he started to penetrate her, she closed her eyes, determined it was wrong to watch him while he did this to her. He smiled at her shyness, but didn't stop moving within her. Now that he'd sated himself in her last night, he was certain he could last until she was finished this time. He wanted to see her face while she had her first fulfillment. He rocked in and out of her, reaching down to wrap one of her legs around his slim hips. She moved her other leg on her own. He loved watching her face as she experienced the new pleasures. If she'd had any idea how wanton she looked, he knew she'd never allow him to touch her in daylight again. Her head moved back and forth on the pillow as she came close to achieving her goal, and finally, she arched her neck as her pleasure was upon her. He thrust a few more times and finished quickly, content to collapse to her side and pull her into his arms. She sighed happily, snuggling her face against his chest. I really don't think we're supposed to do that when it's light out. She felt the need to make sure he knew how she felt about it, but she was too content to really complain much. He laughed softly. We won't do it during the day when the girls are here. He turned her face up to his for one more quick kiss. Will that work for my sweet wife? She blushed but nodded. I suppose it will have to do. He rolled out of bed, unashamed of his nudity, and pulled his work clothes from the drawer. Are you going to lie in bed all day, or are you going to fix my breakfast? He fastened the buttons on his shirt as he watched her hiding herself under the covers. I'll get up in a minute. What she meant was she'd get up as soon as he'd left the room, and he knew it as well as she did. He gave her a knowing look as he buttoned his shirt and took his socks and shoes from the closet. "I'll see you downstairs." He left, closing the door behind him. She stayed in bed for a moment to make sure he wasn't coming back right away, and then jumped out of bed to scramble into her clothes. Emily smiled as she made the bed and straightened the room. Her marriage was off to a good start.